Dublin, August 1982. A detective has been awake for most of the last 17 days. He has a description, a photograph, and now, finally, an address. They knock. The door opens. The man standing there, in a silk dressing gown, looking faintly inconvenienced by the hour, is not a murderer. He is the Attorney General of Ireland. The killer is 20 feet away, in a spare bedroom, reading the newspaper. This is not a story about madness. It is a story about a man who believed, for his entire adult life, that he was simply too important for the ordinary moral weight of the world to land on him, in a country that gave him every reason to think he was right. Edward Calloway grew up in the Irish Midlands, on a country estate with a name rather than a number. Long gravel driveway, walled garden, rooms full of furniture that had been expensive once and was now simply old. It was enough to establish, early and permanently, the impression that he was set apart from ordinary people. His father communicated through absence. His mother through correct manners and emotional distance. Between them, they raised a boy who received almost everything except close human connection. He was given books, freedom, and the unexamined assumption of superiority. He was never given a reason to question it, that he read voraciously. Philosophy, history, classical literature. By his teens, he had the kind of intellectual confidence that looks, from a distance, like genuine depth. He traveled London, Paris, Rome, not as a tourist but as a connoisseur. He had opinions about wine and architecture and the failings of the working class. What he was never required to have was a job. Work is not merely income. It is the daily confrontation with the gap between what you believe you are and what the world actually requires. It teaches you that other people are real, that their time has value, that you are not, in the arithmetic of a functioning society, exceptional. Edward Calloway was never taught that lesson when his parents died. He inherited approximately £70,000, which in the mid-1970s was a significant sum. Enough that if managed with modest care, it could provide a quiet income for a decade or more. But he did not manage it with modest care. He moved through Europe's good hotels and fine restaurants, drifting from city to city with the ease of a man who has never needed to justify himself to anyone. He was charming company, well-read, well-traveled, with an anecdote for every occasion. But there was no one who truly knew him. No one he let close enough to see that underneath the performance, there was simply a man who had mistaken inherited wealth for personal worth and had no idea what he would do when one ran out of money. And by the early 1980s, the money was almost gone. He had taken no steps to address it. The idea of earning a living, of submitting a CV, of occupying a position defined by someone else's requirements, was so far outside his conception of himself that it barely registered as an option. Since none of that made sense to him, he was going to think of something else. By the spring of 1982, the money was gone. Not trickling away. Gone. The accounts that had once cushioned him against consequence were empty. 15 years of hotels and dinners and the accumulated cost of a life lived entirely on the surface had done what arithmetic always does. They had won. Edward Calloway was 41 years old. No profession, no income, no savings. He had never filed a tax return because he had never earned a taxable wage. He was, in the cold language of the real world, a man with nothing. What he did have was a self-image. A complete, deeply reinforced, utterly unexamined self-image that told him he was not like other people. Sharper, more cultivated, more deserving. The ordinary indignities of working life were for people who had not been given his advantages. Most people, confronted with financial collapse, go through something recognizable: panic, shame, and then the slow, humbling work of rebuilding. They take the smaller flat. They eat cheaper food. They accept the job they wouldn't have looked at twice 5 years earlier. It cost them something in pride, but they pay it because being a person in the world requires it. Edward Calloway refused. Not dramatically, not with rage. He simply, quietly, rationally refused. Adjusting his life downward would have required admitting that he was, at bottom, ordinary. That admission was more intolerable than anything else he could imagine. So he made a plan that he would rob a bank. He approached it the way he approached everything, with the detached confidence of a man who believes he is too clever to fail. He would acquire a weapon. He would acquire a getaway car. He would execute the plan. Life would continue on his terms. There was one problem with this plan. It required him to interact, violently, with other human beings. Edward Calloway had never, in 41 years of life, truly reckoned with the fact that other people were real. He needed a car first. He would take it from a person, somewhere public, somewhere people sat alone, somewhere no one would expect danger on a summer afternoon. He settled on Phoenix Park, and he put a hammer in his coat. Phoenix Park is one of the largest enclosed city parks in the world. 1,100 acres of grassland and long winding paths where Dublin goes to breathe. On a warm July afternoon in 1982, it was exactly what it always was, full of ordinary life. Families on blankets, children running, couples walking slowly, people sitting in parked cars with windows down, simply existing in the uncomplicated way that people exist on good summer days when nothing is wrong. Her name was Claire Moran. She was 25 years old, a nurse at one of Dublin's city hospitals. She was a kind-hearted person. She remembered names. She stayed past her shift when needed. She had the gift of making the people in her care feel genuinely seen rather than managed. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of person the world needed more of. On this afternoon, she was sitting in her car, parked along one of the park's interior roads, windows down. The summer coming in. She had known where she immediately needed to be. Edward Calloway walked toward her car. He was carrying a hammer inside his coat. He wasn't planning to use the hammer. He knocks and casually asks for directions. When she lowers the window, he switches, demanding her phone, bag, and keys. She hesitates. She reaches for her phone. He panics. The hammer comes out. Not to use, just to threaten. She tries to start the car. He reacts. One impulsive swing, and everything goes silent. He didn't mean for it to go that far, but now there's no undoing it. Moments later, someone had seen a woman slumped in a car and called for help. The medical crew pulled over, and standing near the vehicle, composed, upright, well-dressed, was Edward Calloway. The driver made an assumption. The man looked calm. He looked like a doctor, a professional, someone in authority. The driver asked if Calloway needed an escort to the hospital. Edward Calloway said yes, and proceeded to drive Claire's car. The ambulance drove alongside him, lights and sirens clearing the Dublin traffic. The emergency services of the city, deployed to save a woman's life, escorted her attacker through the streets in broad daylight. He arrived at the hospital. He walked away from the car, then he disappeared into the city. Claire Moran died of her injuries 2 days later. She was 25 years old. She had a ward full of patients who would miss her. She had a family who had no framework, no possible framework, for what had happened to their daughter on an ordinary summer afternoon. Edward Calloway was already thinking about the next step. He needed a shotgun. He placed the call to Thomas Fagan. Thomas Fagan had farmed the same land in County Meath for 30 years. A modest land, not rich, not particularly fertile, but his. He kept cattle. He managed his fences and drainage and the 100 small repairs that a working farm generates without pause. He was a man of his land. In the most literal and grounded sense, he was, in short, everything that Edward Calloway had spent his entire life disdaining. When the call came about the shotgun, Thomas had no reason for suspicion. He had placed a modest advertisement in a local paper, the kind of transaction that happens hundreds of times a week across rural Ireland. The man on the phone had asked the right questions. He sounded educated. He sounded like the right kind of buyer. 3 days had passed since Claire Moran's death. 3 days in which Calloway had moved quietly through the city, apparently undisturbed. The police investigation had begun. Claire's photograph was on every front page. Dublin was shaken in the particular way a violent crime shakes a city that hasn't yet learned to expect violence completely. And with a kind of collective disbelief, Edward Calloway read the papers. He knew what he had done. He drove out to see the farmer about the shotgun. Thomas Fagan came out to meet him. They talked about the gun, its history, its condition, and what it was good for. When Thomas handed it over for inspection, Edward Calloway turned it on him and fired. Thomas Fagan was killed on his own land, in front of his own farmhouse, by a man he had invited onto his property in good faith, offering the basic rural courtesy of a straightforward transaction. He was 53 years old. He had spent 30 years building something modest and real. Calloway stole the car. He drove back toward Dublin, unhurried, the plan still in motion, and 2 people were dead. Both had trusted him. Both had extended him a basic human courtesy, and both had paid for it with their lives. Edward Calloway was not, so far as anyone could tell, troubled by this. He was completely emotionless. The bank robbery never happened. This is, in a darkly ironic way, the most revealing detail of the entire story. Edward Calloway killed 2 people to build toward a crime he never managed to commit. The weapon, the car, the methodical preparation, it produced nothing except bodies. The actual objective, he had told himself, that justified everything never materialized. In the days following Thomas Fagan's murder, Calloway made an approach on a foreign diplomat near the National Botanical Gardens. An easier target, perhaps, or a change of plan. The logic is unclear. What we know is that it failed. The diplomat resisted, or the moment collapsed. Calloway withdrew. The money he had set out to acquire remained firmly unacquired. For the first time in this saga, Edward Calloway was somewhere he had no plan for. His face was on radio bulletins. His description was being circulated. The Garda had begun reconstructing his movements, interview by interview, step by step. 2 murders, a botched approach, a manhunt that was closing and not with drama, but with the slow, administrative certainty of a system that doesn't stop. He needed to disappear, not permanently. Even now, Calloway does not appear to have considered fleeing the country or going aground in any serious way. His psychology didn't accommodate that kind of surrender. He needed somewhere to wait, somewhere safe, comfortable, and above suspicion. He did not hide in a squat. He did not sleep rough or take a room in a boarding house. That would have been, to his sensibility, beneath him. He hid in the way that a man of his background hides, by moving toward comfort and respectability, toward the social world he knew. He went through his mental inventory of acquaintances, people with good addresses and no reason to ask hard questions. And one name stood out, Arthur Pemberton. They had known each other for years, through dinners, mutual acquaintances, shared social geography. Not intimate friends, but friendly in the comfortable way of their class. Pemberton was a safe address. Calloway called him. Pemberton, with no reason in the world to connect a high-standing acquaintance to the murders filling the national news, said yes. What Pemberton did not know was that Calloway was not merely an acquaintance in temporary difficulty. He was the most wanted man in Ireland, and Pemberton's flat was the official residence of the Attorney General of the Irish state. Arthur Pemberton was one of the most senior legal figures in Ireland. The Attorney General advises the government, ensures that state actions are legally sound, and represents the idea that no one, not citizens, not ministers, not the government itself, is above the law. That Pemberton took this role seriously. By the accounts of those who worked with him, he was meticulous, proper, deeply committed to the legal architecture of the state. He was also a man who had grown up in a specific social world, one where certain kinds of people were extended automatically and without scrutiny, a level of trust that others were not. Not malice, not conspiracy, just the invisible operating system of class, running in the background of every social interaction. And so, for somewhere between 5 and 10 days, while detectives worked their leads and Claire Moran's family buried their daughter and Thomas Fagan's farm stood empty in the Meath countryside, Edward Calloway lived quietly in Arthur Pemberton's flat that he was, by all accounts, a model house guest. Tidy, undemanding. He read. He ate whatever was available. He was, as he had always been in social settings, pleasant company, measured, intellectually engaged, knowing when to talk and when to stay quiet. Pemberton, meanwhile, was going about the ordinary business of being Attorney General, attending meetings, advising the government, coming home in the evenings to a flat that contained the most wanted man in the country. Did he know? That question would define Pemberton's legacy. The official conclusion, and by all evidence the truthful one, is that he did not. The cognitive leap required to look at a well-spoken, well-mannered old acquaintance and decide he is capable of beating a nurse to death with a hammer is not one that most people's minds make easily. But the optics were devastating, because Pemberton was not a private citizen who happened to know the wrong person. He was the chief law officer of the Irish state, the man whose professional identity was built on the premise that justice applies to everyone equally. And the killer was in his spare room. Whatever Calloway was waiting for, a fading of the investigation, an opportunity, some version of normalcy to resume, it did not arrive. Instead, something happened that no one who has studied this case has ever fully explained. Edward Calloway picked up the phone and called the police himself. He told them it was a prank. When police arrived at Arthur Pemberton's flat on the 14th of August, 1982, Edward Calloway did not run. He did not fight. He made no attempt to delay what was happening. He was cooperative, calm, almost indifferent. And when officers confronted him about the murders, about Claire Moran and Thomas Fagan, about the hammer and the shotgun and the 17 days of national terror, he told them it had all been a prank. A prank. 2 people murdered in cold blood. A nurse in a park. A farmer on his own land. A national manhunt, a country in fear, a prank. Scholars of this case have considered whether this was legal strategy, an attempt to create ambiguity to buy time, whether it reflected genuine psychological detachment, whether, at some level, he simply did not experience what he had done with the weight it deserved. It is also possible it was the most honest thing he ever said. Because in Edward Calloway's internal world, what he had done was closer to a practical exercise than an atrocity. He had needed things. He had acquired them. Other people had been obstacles. He had removed them. Then he was arrested. He said nothing further of substance. Arthur Pemberton had to make a phone call. He called the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, to inform him that the flat of the country's Attorney General had been serving for the better part of a fortnight as a safe house for Ireland's most wanted double murderer. The Taoiseach described the situation as, and this is on the record, grotesque, unbelievable, bizarre, and unprecedented. A journalist took the first letter of each word GUBU. The acronym entered the Irish political vocabulary immediately and has never left. To this day, when something in Irish public life is so comprehensively, absurdly wrong that ordinary language cannot contain it, the word surfaces. GUBU. It means we have run out of ways to describe how badly this has gone. Arthur Pemberton resigned within days. The legal proceedings were, in their way, almost anticlimactic. After the chaos of the arrest and the hurricane of the GUBU scandal, the courtroom offered something that felt indecent in its quietness. Edward Calloway pleaded guilty to the murder of Claire Moran. He was sentenced to a substantial prison term. He did not take the stand in any meaningful sense. He offered no explanation, no apology, no expression of remorse that anyone present recorded as genuine. He moved through the legal process with the same composed detachment that had characterized everything about him from the beginning, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else, and he was observing them from a polite distance. The families of Claire Moran and Thomas Fagan had to sit in a courtroom and watch this. That fact, the simple, brutal reality of what a trial requires of the people who have lost someone, is not something that legal analysis tends to dwell on, but it is the center of gravity of any honest account of what happened. The press coverage, understandably, concentrated heavily on the political dimension, on Pemberton, on the government, on the GUBU shockwaves still moving through Irish institutional life. The scandal had taken on a shape almost independent of the two people who had died. This is a thing that happens in cases like this, and it is worth naming. The political story was real and deserved scrutiny. But underneath it, at the base of everything, were Claire Moran and Thomas Fagan, a nurse and a farmer. Two people who had never had any connection to Edward Calloway's self-created crisis, who had simply existed clearly, fully, with their own irreplaceable particularity, until he decided they were useful to him. They did not survive to see justice. But justice was in its limited and imperfect way delivered. The doors closed, and Ireland was left with the slower, less dramatic work of understanding what had happened. Not just the crime, but the conditions that produced it. The climate that had allowed a man like Edward Calloway to move through 40 years of life believing, with complete confidence, that the world was arranged for his benefit and its other inhabitants were supporting cast. That work is never really finished. Conclusion of all relevant investigations was that he had been genuinely, catastrophically deceived. He had simply done what his entire social formation taught him to do, extended trust to a man who seemed, by virtue of education and bearing, to be worthy of it. He paid a severe price for that. Whether it was the right price is a question that has no clean answer. He was not complicit. He was not corrupt. He was a victim of the same invisible architecture that had shaped Edward Calloway. The architecture that told certain men they could be trusted without scrutiny, that their appearance of respectability was equivalent to their character. Edward Calloway served his sentence and was released in the early 2000s. He has maintained an almost complete public silence ever since. There was no interviews, no memoirs, no engagement of any kind with the story that defined his life and ended two others. Whatever is inside him remains, as it always was, sealed. This is, in its way, a final act of the same performance. The man who spent 40 years believing he was too important for ordinary accountability has spent the decades since refusing the explanation and remorse that might offer some form of closure to the people who needed it most. The story of Edward Calloway is told most often as a crime story, sometimes as a political story, but I think the most honest framing is simpler than any of those. This is a story about what happens when a society teaches a certain kind of person, for long enough, consistently enough, that they are exempt. Exempt from the humbling work of ordinary life. Exempt from the requirement to see other people as fully real. Exempt from the weight that comes with being a person in the world alongside other persons. Edward Calloway did not wake up one morning and decide to become a killer. He arrived at that point by a road that was built for him, paved over decades, by a world that kept telling him he was different, better, above. And the consequence of that road was that a 25-year-old nurse died in a Dublin park, and a 53-year-old farmer died on his own land. Claire Moran, Thomas Fagan, they were real in every way that Edward Calloway decided at the crucial moment that they were not.